各位，当越来越多的人重新关注地缘政治的时候，一个耐人寻味的现象正在出现：亲身经验和主流叙事之间正在形成一个明显的不对称。钱德兰·奈尔这一位长期生活在亚洲，同时参与国际智库工作的研究者，用一个非常克制的标签概括这一种差异：经验与叙事中的结构性错位。在社交平台上，关于中国的讨论不断的升温，却很少有人停下来追问，我们理解的世界方式本身是否已经被预设好？这一个问题并不是新的问题，却正在变得格外的现实。过去10几年里，国际新闻对中国的叙事高度集中在制度、价值和立场上，但很少解释结构差异本身是如何产生的。以中国为观察点，用中国的角度去看，就会发现东西方在理解治理、发展和合法性上，起点并不相同。西方媒体习惯从程序与话语出发，而中国的现实更多围绕着是承诺、改善生活与维持系统稳定展开。这并不是立场之争，而是结构逻辑的不同呈现。而真正的核心矛盾在于，当西方仍在以表达是否充分来衡量制度的时候，中国社会更关注的是结果是否持续。表面上来看，这是价值取向的差异，但在结构层面，它连接着产业组织方式、长期规划能力以及社会承载的机制。西方体系高度依赖短周期的政治反馈，政治更替频繁，而中国的治理结构强调的是跨周期执行力，通过层级体系不断校验能力与绩效，看似缺乏外显博弈，实质是一套以结果为合法性来源的运行机制。这一种差异恰恰是许多误读的起点。从这一个角度来看，中国的结构优势并不体现在于某一个制度的设计上，而是体现在长期协调能力还有系统整合效率上。当外部叙事反复追问是否会失控的时候，更值得关注的是，到底哪一些变量可能会真正改变这一套结构的运行条件呢？下一步的不确定性不在于情绪的冲突，而在于结构张力如何被消化和调整。这也是理解中国问题的时候最容易被忽略却最关键的悬念所在。我们看一下视频。
Like many people who have an interest in geopolitics, I've been following, though I'm not a geopolitical expert as such, but interested in development, lived in Africa, etc. When I came to Hong Kong about more than 25 years ago, I went to a China that's very different from today. And I've been following that, observing. But at the same time, people like us read the international mainstream media, which is a whole different topic about why we get all our information from those sources. But I like to think I've freed myself of that ailment now, and so we have it more diverse. But it's part of the education, our colonial upbringing, etc. So what was very interesting to me, particularly going back about 10 years, was what I was seeing in China and what I was reading in the newspapers, particularly the mainstream media. And having put a lot of faith in this concept of, the liberal media essentially being honest, that it's journalists were there to report on the facts, and this idea that journalism is supposed to inform us, I came to the conclusion there was something so disconnected between what I was seeing and what was being reported, and being on the front line both in Hong Kong, etc. And so I started to question this. But the realization was that people like me had been indoctrinated too in believing that whatever I read in the mainstream Western media must be true, or whatever I heard on BBC, CNN, CNBC must be true. And once I shifted that and began to look, and then, of course, ground truth, what I was seeing, it became very clear to me that there was a concerted effort to, not describe China, and there are many other countries in the world, but because I'm close to China and China was being demonized, that there was a need, that there was something going on. So I started to write a few articles about questions like articles that said, China can't be all bad. There must be some good things about it. Can we hear about it? Things like that, and gave examples. So over time, and then about 2-3 years ago, I'm a member of the Club of Rome. And for those of you who don't know, it's an old established think tank. And a few of us who are more sympathetic to a more multipolar world and a more nuanced understanding of what's going on rather than the sort of polarized geopolitical Cold War stance, formed the Club of Rome China. And we decided that one of our missions would be to explain China. And I took on the task of writing that first book, given that I'd already become immersed as a non-Chinese person, but living in China in this very strange sort of view of me being in China, seeing certain things, non-Chinese, and then reading all of this in my so-called favorite international magazines or newspapers and seeing it very differently. So I thought, and in the last, we wrote that book with the Club of Rome, but in the last 18 months decided that we should get an international publication to publish it because it's so important that people understand. And may I just conclude that response to your comment by saying that, most books look to criticize or praise. There is the anti-China and then there's the sort of pro-Beijing camp. This book seeks to do neither. What it does is it does not seek to criticize, and there's tons of stuff every day. You can open the newspaper today and read that, the fire in Hong Kong, the catastrophic fire, is apparently the fault of China. So because it doesn't criticize, some will see it as pro-China. That is to miss the point. The book lays out the facts, the issues, and observations as well from me and others, the members of the Club of Rome China, and allowing the reader to decide. It does not tell you or seek to persuade you to like or dislike China. It persuades you to examine the facts, and analyze the data and come to your own conclusions. So the hope is that people will better understand China, from whatever perspective, but come to the conclusion that, there's much more nuances to the understanding of China than is in the mainstream media, and appreciate that most of what people hear about China, sadly, in the mainstream media is not balanced, and we try to provide a balanced view of China. So that's the genesis of the book. So what is legitimacy? In the Western sort of neoliberal discourse, legitimacy is, we have a democratic process, someone gets elected or the party, and therefore they are legitimate. So, if you look at the United States today, there's a lot of people who don't like the policies of the current administration, but they would argue that the current administration is legitimate. In Europe, I think the point you were making was that they are not popular, but they would argue we are legitimate. So if you look in the UK, I don't know how many prime ministers they've had in the last 5 years. I've lost count. But the current incumbent of Downing Street is extremely unpopular and seems to be losing, popularity in the polls. But he is legitimate in terms of the political process. So in the Chinese context, I don't think the question is one of legitimacy. It is essentially one of delivering on promise and delivering on improving quality of life, security, and allowing people to understand the complexities of the country they live in. And that then gives rise to the sort of support that you have, the numbers, 3 out of 4, etc. I mean, I think there's surveys done independently by international organizations which have shown that if there were elections, the Chinese Communist Party would win hands down. You could argue there's not enough opposition, and that is correct, but that is not the way to look at the Chinese system. But they are extremely popular. So to paraphrase you in terms of the legitimacy in terms of results. And the point I try and make is, and this is also the sort of basis by which Singapore initially was highly criticized, particularly Lee Kuan Yew, for being a dictator going back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But he did have legitimacy in terms of he did have an election process. It was considered because he was uncompromising in his commitment to developing the country. Then he was accused of being a dictator. And then further arguments that the opposition is weak and all of that. The Chinese system, though, in terms of legitimacy, is rooted in delivery of results and communitarian sort of commitment to results. If that starts to fail, the population begins to express its displeasure in ways that are not well understood or, in fact, even acknowledged by mainstream Western media, because in their view, there should be a revolution and everything should be burned down and a new system put in place. But that's not how that system works, and it's never worked that way, except when in previous eras there were sort of upheavals which were triggered by a whole host of other things. So the point of legitimacy or acceptance or support of the government in China by the majority of people is because their lives have improved remarkably in the last 30, 40 years. And the other point I would say, Chinese also understand their country and history. They know what happened and they treasure peace, and they know that to disrupt what is on balance a good system that has worked for them, not perfect, they all understand there are people who are critical of the system. They all don't turn up in jail, by the way, as is simplified. I have been to village meetings where they're hugely critical of the government, they're critical of the party head, etc., and ask for changes. But they understand that chaos is not what they want. So work within the system, and that's also civilizational understanding of the system. And I'll also say one more thing: deep rooted in that Chinese political economy and civilizational approach to governance is the issue of meritocracy, which is a cultural feature. And we at the Global Institute tomorrow, we've actually had a webinar recently about this, that a cultural feature of the political economy is actually the question of meritocracy, which goes back 2,000 years. So you have to prove you're good enough. And if you go to most places in China, and I'm sure you have, Jyotish, that you can go to small towns that most people have never heard of, populations of 2 to 3 million. You can meet the mayor and the vice mayor, and they will be in their mid-40s with double degrees, highly competent, highly educated, and not just card-carrying members of a defunct political system. And they have to prove themselves every day of the week with KPIs as well. Meritocracy and hard work is valued and respected in China, right? That doesn't mean I'm saying that there aren't people who break the rules or like any society. But in a governance system, the legitimacy, as you said, of any institution, be it the village level or the town level or provincial level, is very much linked to: have you performed? Have you done what you're supposed to do? And for that, then linked to that is, can you do the job? Are you qualified? You're not just some elected person who just comes in and says, well, I think I can do the job. And we all seen in the United States people who are elected, very populous, etc., but questionable whether they were suited to actually be a president of a country, particularly one with such a global impacts in terms of internal politics resulting in decisions that could affect people around the world. So the Chinese system respects and values hard work, and at the government side, a commitment to society and the community. And very importantly, do you have the capabilities to do the work? And I think what happened over the last 20 years, or even going back a bit, I mean, the early years was a struggle with all all the reform and entering the market economy, etc. But I think factors for the rise of China are not just economic. There are many factors, and I'll just outline a couple of them. But then were fundamentally understood to be wholly dependent on the capacity at each level to trickle down the competence. And I talk about this in my book on the sustainable state, that, who cares what you call it, but you need to have competence, and you need to have that capability built through. So I think the factors for China's rise, I think many might know, but just to cite a couple of things, the reform started by saying productivity should be the center of economic reforms, right? So productivity-centered economic reforms. Then they understood to have that, you need to have intense investment in infrastructure. And you can't do that if you don't have very competent institutions and leaders to do that at every level. And then a very deep understanding going back 20, 30 years ago on strategic and intense technical research, which built competency at a technical level, but also at an administrative level, because in a large country like that, you need both to complement. This then gave rise into coming back into the institutions of learning, hundreds of thousands of highly confident, confident, and hardworking bureaucrats to come in the system. And very distinctively, the commitment to the community, the communitarian sort of spirit embedded within the civilization as well. The highest compliment you can give a Chinese person, I think, is that they serve the society, a sort of collective civil society approach to your work. And then I think the other part of it is the commitment to long-term political planning. I don't need to tell you, you can't compare what is happening in the United States, where there is the concept of long-term has gone because of the vested interests of short-term political interests. So long-term political planning allows you to invest in building all of these things and nurturing hundreds of thousands of extremely capable civil servants. And serving through society, through the civil service, is seen as an extremely noble profession as well in China. So those are the things that I would say, help to develop this whole sort of competency, meritocracy, and outcome-driven professionals that serve inside the Chinese government. That doesn't mean there aren't corrupt officials, there aren't incompetent ones. But, as you have seen and heard, there has been a complete commitment to weeding out incompetence and corruption. It's not like in every country of the world. It still persists in pockets. But I can say from my own experience, and I can give many anecdotes, which we don't have time for, it has reached even the most rural areas of China, that the fight against corruption and incompetence in terms of public administration. If you follow some of the stuff on social media in China, WeChat, TikTok, and other stuff that goes on, some of the most interesting, outrageous fashion in the world I've seen is in China. I mean, the expression, right? So it's not about nudity. It's not about, showing your butt, but it is full forms of expression. And I encourage anyone who's interested in fashion to go and see what's happening, even in small towns, how people express themselves, and at the same time embracing the historic context and where they live, etc. It's a bit like, when we used to see, for those who are interested, outrageous fashion coming out of Japan in the 80s and the 90s, some of the coolest stuff. I would say today some of the coolest stuff you can find in terms of that formal expression is actually happening in China. Now, in terms of civil society, as you rightly pointed out, we're all steeped in that Western canon of thought about what is civil society, etc. But in China, such a large country, the government seeks to essentially leverage civil society, and civil society seeks to leverage the government because it's so large, and cities are big, but villages, etc., so remote. So it's actually not in the sort of mindset, and this is a big trap that sadly many Western commentators and civil society groups in the West, they expect other societies to have the same sort of organizing principles as they have. I hate to say it, but it's a height of arrogance. Other societies do organize differently. And a cooperative approach, in my view, and I think you will agree, in our countries in the world where, you light a fire, it can go out of control. And we've seen this in the so-called Arab Springs, etc., where, couch revolutionaries sitting in rich countries were urging people to go out in the streets, and the consequences were dire. I think the Chinese understand that, both the civil society side and the government. So they kind of work together. The Chinese are also extremely well aware, and modern history is littered with civil society groups from the West, many of whom I admire, by the way, but have also been used by the governments to infiltrate and create social unrest. I know the Indian government is extremely sensitive about these issues, etc. So in China, the whole point is to work together. I know a member of a civil society group, a large one on the environment and biodiversity in China, who has full support of the government and was the first to go out and sue and put test cases in court against large Chinese companies going back 20 years, which were polluting the environment. I know another one that was set up the first, independent and supported by the government, but they did it independently to start monitoring air pollution around cities. And going back 20 years with the rudimentary technology we had then, which enabled the government then to learn from them about remote sensing and how to do all of this and actually get the public engaged. And today that civil society group is extremely well known. The founder is extremely well respected. And so that's how it works in China. I think, again, if I put on my sort of Western liberal hat training, then I would say that what the Chinese government doesn't tolerate is where you see civil society simply as a mechanism for protest and advocacy against things you don't like, which in certain societies clearly there is room for. In other societies, it can be exploited, and the Chinese government does not permit that. Does it sit comfortably with everyone? No. But the majority of Chinese take it as the balance that they have to live with, and then use the system effectively to bring about change. And, let's be very clear that it's now widely acknowledged that environmental improvements in China are amongst the most rapid that any country has achieved in 20 years. And it is naive to think that the Chinese government did this all by itself. No, it did not. It did it with civil society. But civil society, and I talk about this in my book on the sustainable state, is not organized groups necessarily. There are movements of people. And I know small towns, particularly in the Sichuan area, in the Tibetan highlands, etc., which are terribly messy, unhygienic, etc., just 15 years ago. Today, there are toilets everywhere. The surface waters are all clean. There's no rubbish. There's hundreds of thousands of trees have been planted. And these were not done by PLA soldiers and Beijing sending workers to these places. These were done by even the monasteries, the temples, and society coming together, but supported by government. So the achievements that China is, often in terms of the environment, renewable energy, etc., have been praised for. Civil society in China, not defined through the classical Western lens, have been instrumental in that. But not all of them can be happy because, if you're drawn to civil society, you're drawn because you have such high expectations. And so people try and work together. I think this is where the system in China has been put in place, that those who are, are drawn to those issues and causes and are activists are well steeped in understanding the boundaries. Now, the mainstream media would then say, oh, they're scared. No, they're respectful of their boundaries, right? And they understand those boundaries can shift over time. And many have shifted because they've proactively worked with the government. I mean, Jyotish, you're from India. I mean, India has probably got the largest amount of NGOs per square inch in the world, right? Extremely committed, good people working tirelessly for the public and common good. But India hasn't achieved as much, and partly not because the government's negligent, but they haven't found the formula for their country, given the political cycles. You get one come in and they don't like this sort of subject matter, etc. So, you mentioned LGBTQ. I mean, there's an active LGBTQ community in all countries, all cities in China. But the Chinese don't want others coming and saying, to politically activate it. It's a bit like, they say there's religious suppression in China. I've been to parts of China. I come from Malaysia, as you said, and I tell my Malaysian friends there are places in Gansu where I've traveled, and in 1 hour I've seen more masjids and mosques than I've seen in all of Malaysia. But the Chinese system, whether you like it or not, and I think most people agree, says you can pray, you can do all your beliefs, but please don't bring political religion onto the public space. That's their rule. None, right? And I've sent, people, friends I know, videos of the breaking of fast in major Chinese cities in mosques, and they've been shocked at the scale of all of this. So I think this is important to understand. They understand the boundaries and then they work together. The most successful NGOs that I know, and I've worked with NGOs around the world, I found Chinese NGOs gained much more success than NGOs in other countries. In my own country, the major conservation issue now is how do we save the tiger? And India has been huge success, as you know, in saving the tiger. Why? Civil society, rural communities, and the government worked, and there they found a formula. It's a massive success story around the world. You know that better than I do. My country is not working because the NGOs are small, they are disparate, and where some international NGOs have come about, they have used tactics which I kind of agree. They're vocal about it, but what does it do? It puts off our government people, and therefore it doesn't work. But in China, particularly in terms of biodiversity and in the more highland areas, as you know, the grasslands and the mountainous areas, the efforts of some of the NGOs have been incredibly successful, particularly in efforts to save the snow leopard and some of the grassland and fauna, and even some of the flora. And there the NGOs have worked because they're such vast areas with government support, with the local indigenous communities, some of the nomadic communities amongst the Tibetans, etc., and got results. And for me, the realization was that the scale of the effort needed, you cannot just be shouting and advocating for change. You have to work with a partner. And if you can find the key to work with the government, then you get your objectives because those are aligned. So, as I said, coming back to the LGBTQ issue. I've gone to some crazy clubs in Beijing and Shanghai where it's all in the open. But as far as Chinese officials, what I can see, it's not politics. It's fine. But when it's used by the media to criticize China, then rightly or wrongly, the Chinese response sometimes seems to be something that then adds more fuel to the fire, if I can put it that way, right? But and it's a bit like India, right? More conservative Indians don't want you to talk about the subject, right? The conservative view, but the Western media can make it out to be that, oh my God, everyone's oppressed. Clearly, some people are under lots of pressure not to come out, which is not good, right? I mean, but to then distort it, I don't think serves either side, the issue, nor the people who feel they are being ill-treated or not allowed to openly express their views or preferences. So I'd first qualify any response I provide that it's my lived experience, if you can call it, of going to China when it was very poor. The first time I went to Beijing, there were no new cars. Most people were on bicycles, and everyone was wearing a mouse suit. And I stayed at the Beijing Hotel, which is in Tiananmen Square, and you didn't get a key to your door. Someone opened the door for you, etc. So it's very poor. So my experiences from that, I like to think I'm pretty well versed now with the sort of economic sort of fundamentals, and I have a different point of view from the mainstream sort of liberal economic free market theories, etc., which most people I think now understand too, that there are different formulas for different countries. My main take would be that what opened up the country really and created that jump was essentially a very strong sort of substantive public spending, right? Which was steeped in sort of monetary policy that was not dependent on essentially just foreign direct investment, because China is very big. So substantive public spending. And that started, at least in my observation, by making sure that the large cities began to operate in ways where economic productivity would be unleashed. If you want people to work hard and you want people to unleash the potential and you want factories and means of production to improve, you're going to have to spend in public. You have to have substantial public spending. What also happened was, of course, China welcomed the world. And I know that the more conservative Americans tend to think that they did China a favor. One could argue it was the other way around too, right? But China embraced the world. But very importantly with all of this was it then understood and embedded the integration of the global supply chains into the Chinese economy. It didn't just go and do its own thing. It understood how the world worked. It took a fair bit of time, but it was quicker than most in understanding. And it understood its competitive advantages of scale and cheap labor, etc. So that was very important. And then it also sort of started to develop very strong links with, later on, with having a presence in many developing countries and getting involved. And the Belt and Road was also part of all of that. And institutional reforms were central. So in the early days, it was the institutional reforms of the SOE. So I think the economic transformation in China was state-led because at that early stage, you needed that vision long-term. But then the Chinese system essentially cascaded it through, and at the provincial levels, it was not dictated by Beijing saying you should build this road and you should do this. There was almost competition between the provinces, both for state support, and then that trickled down to the municipalities and towns. So sort of liberating everything. The other thing I would say, and particularly with regard to then the technological sort of burst that also propelled us, was the Chinese ability to embrace new things. They didn't just close it down. And I was speaking to a well-known China, one of the leading Chinese commentators just a month ago about what will China do to rein in the potential threat of AI. Because all of us are scared of what might happen despite its power, but we all, if we are honest, know it carries huge risk. And I think, as you know, many of the founding fathers and mothers of AI are warning governments, but no one's taking heed. And so I asked him, and he said, "Oh, we are extremely aware of the threats." But he said, our approach is not to shut it down. Our approach is to embrace and see where it goes. But at the same time, we have enough checks and balances in the system that the entrepreneurs, the people who are at the forefront of technology, know what the limits are. And this I found very interesting. They know if they go too far and breach and test the system, they will feel the sort of repercussions of the state. That I thought was very interesting. But it's also interesting to me that about 6 months ago, I was invited to a one-day closed-door work conference of some of the leading tech companies in China. It was all in Chinese. I think I was one of 3 foreigners there, and I had a translator in front of me. I was really interested in how they spoke about technology, but not simply from the point of view of profit making. Yeah, you live in the United States. If you went to the US, the discussion is very much about valuations and this and that, and which VC. There was no talk about it taking money. It was the application of AI to complex problems. I thought that was very interesting. And the complex problems were typically about application to industry issues, improving the way people could work, but it was also not about displacing people. That was interesting. So I asked the question, as the person who was there to say, but surely you know that the whole point of all of this technology is to displace people, because otherwise the productivity gains are not there. And then the counter argument is that new jobs will be created because new industries. And what was so interesting to me, a panel of 5 sort of leading experts in this, was so honest about the challenge that I had suggested. And they were willing, they talked about it and said, this is a real problem for society too. So I think this is where the openness. But to your point, I think the main thing that triggered this is long-term planning, no short-term political cycles. I know of a railway system that's being built at the moment through Central Asia, and it's taking sections of it built, connected major towns, but it's a 15-year project, and the last bit is now being done. So it's long-term, it's substantial investments, mobilizing across the country and integrating with global supply chains as well. But can I just add one more point? There's also a big focus on looking at education as a means to build a new category of people. And many of the new AI firms in China, many of the startups and founders were not educated in the US, they were all educated in China as well.